Nicole Peterson had the perfect life, or so it seemed. A beautiful family, a loving husband, and a peaceful neighborhood. But behind closed doors, a dark secret was brewing, and one night, everything changed. What appeared to be a simple domestic dispute quickly escalated into something far more terrifying, leaving her dead and her husband vanished. But here's the chilling twist. There was a silent witness to it all, a secret that no one knew existed until it was too late. What was captured that night will haunt you. Stay tuned as we unravel the truth behind the murder of Nicole Peterson. Nicole Peterson was the kind of woman everyone trusted. Her home was always immaculately kept, her children well-behaved, and her husband Matthew seemed every bit the charming, successful businessman. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect family, something far more sinister lurked. Nicole's marriage was a fragile facade, built on secrets and a mounting sense of dread. For years, she had endured Matthew's volatile temper, his outbursts that seemed to come from nowhere, followed by apologies that only made the storm feel more inevitable. The quiet suburb where they lived was blissfully unaware of the darkness that haunted Nicole's every day. She had learned to live with the terror of walking on eggshells, pretending that everything was fine, while her husband's mood swings grew more unpredictable and dangerous. But even she couldn't ignore the unsettling changes in him. The angry outbursts were becoming more frequent, and the tension in their home was palpable. Nicole would lay awake at night, hearing the sound of Matthew pacing in the living room, his muffled voice murmuring threats to no one in particular. The nightmares had started again, vivid dreams where she saw herself trapped in her own house, her screams swallowed by the walls as Matthew loomed over her. In those dreams, she tried to escape, but every door was locked, every window sealed shut. It felt like a warning, but she couldn't decipher it. She knew something was coming, a storm that would be unlike any other. Her friends, her neighbors, everyone thought they were the perfect family. But inside, Nicole was suffocating. One night, after another of Matthew's explosive arguments over trivial matters, the air in the house became heavy, suffocating. Nicole's breath hitched as her heart raced, realizing that the man she once loved was now a stranger to her, a monster hiding behind the mask of a husband. And that night, the storm would break. She had no idea that her worst nightmare was about to become all too real. The night started like any other, a seemingly quiet evening in their home. But the air was thick with an unspoken tension that had been building for weeks. Nicole had always been able to sense it, that crackling undercurrent of violence that clung to her husband's every movement. Matthew had come home late, his usual smile replaced with a hardened look that made her stomach churn. The argument started over nothing. Something trivial about bills, about his failing business, about money. But she could feel the familiar shift in his eyes, that coldness that meant he was no longer the man she married. The words came fast, sharp, cutting through the air like knives, each one a reminder of the man he had become. Nicole tried to keep her voice steady, trying to reason with him, but her words only fueled the fire. The house seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing tighter, as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. She could hear her heart pounding in her chest as she backed into the corner of the living room, her body tense, every muscle screaming to run, but she knew it was useless. The door was locked, the windows shut tight. She was trapped, and the terror began to sink in. Matthew's face twisted in anger, his voice low, almost a growl, as he stepped toward her. She could feel the weight of his presence, the dangerous heat radiating from him, as if the room itself was about to catch fire. Every step he took felt like a countdown to something horrible. Her throat went dry, her mind racing for any way to escape, but there was nothing. The kids were in their room, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding just a few feet away. And then, as if all the years of repressed rage finally boiled over, Matthew struck. Nicole barely had time to react before his hands were around her throat, squeezing with a force that stole the breath from her lungs. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and the world began to blur. She gasped, struggling, but her vision darkened, and just when she thought it would end, she heard the faintest sound. Something in the background, a subtle click. It was the last thing she would ever hear before the room went silent. The house was eerily quiet in the moments after Nicole's final breath, as if the walls themselves were holding their collective breath, trying to erase the horrors that had just unfolded. Her lifeless body lay still on the floor, an unsettling silence hanging in the air, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But there was something else, something far more disturbing, something that would soon unravel the entire nightmare. When the police arrived, after what felt like an eternity, they immediately noticed the oddness of the scene. No blood, no signs of forced entry, no struggle beyond the initial fight. It was as if Nicole had simply been silenced. But then they found it. A small, inconspicuous recording device tucked away in the corner of the living room, its red light blinking like a heartbeat in the stillness. It wasn't just a random coincidence. It had been there all along, capturing every moment of terror. The chilling realization settled over the detectives like a cold, suffocating blanket. Someone had been watching. Someone had been listening. The device had recorded everything. It had captured the soft sound of Nicole's desperate gasps, the haunting echoes of her final moments, and, most disturbingly, it had recorded the silence that followed. As they listened to the tape, the room seemed to close in on them. The usual sounds of a violent crime, the panicked breathing, the struggle, were absent. The sound of Nicole's life slipping away was so quiet, it was as if she had simply faded into the darkness. But what happened next was even more unsettling. The recording continued, but there was nothing. No screams, no movement. Just an unnerving stillness, broken only by the faint creak of a floorboard, followed by the soft thud of a door closing. It was as if Matthew Peterson had vanished into thin air. Where had he gone? How had he escaped? The device recorded nothing more, the silence of the house consuming every trace of him. The terror that had been trapped in that room was now a ghost, leaving behind only one question. Was Nicole the silent witness to her own death, or had something far darker been at play? The answers seemed as elusive as the man who had vanished. The search for Matthew Peterson quickly became a desperate, nationwide manhunt, but despite the police's best efforts, he seemed to have vanished without a trace. The man who once held such power over Nicole's life was now a shadow, slipping through the cracks of the world, as if he had never existed at all. Investigators combed through every inch of their home, but there was nothing that could explain how he had disappeared so completely. Nicole's friends and neighbors were interviewed, each one offering their own version of Matthew, a man they had known as charming, successful, and completely devoted to his family. But behind every polished image, a different truth emerged. As they delved deeper into his background, they discovered troubling inconsistencies. His business dealings were in disarray, and there were whispers of financial troubles, shady deals, and even threats against his own employees. But more disturbing were the personal revelations. Matthew had been hiding debts, lying to everyone around him, and manipulating his wife for years. But why had he gone to such extremes to control her? What had driven him to murder? The answers were buried in the cryptic emails and encrypted files that investigators had uncovered. As they decrypted one particular set of files, the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to fit together. Nicole had been more than just a victim in her own home. She had been a witness to his darkest crimes, a silent observer of his fraudulent activities, and, worst of all, she had been planning to expose him. She had started gathering evidence, collecting documents, and recording his every move, preparing to leave him and take their children with her. Matthew, terrified that his carefully constructed life would crumble, had realized that Nicole was the only person standing between him and ruin. And that night, his fury had been unleashed, knowing she would never stop until she had revealed everything. As detectives pieced together the horrifying truth, one fact became painfully clear. Matthew's disappearance wasn't a mistake, it was calculated. He had planned it all, faking his death and slipping into the shadows, confident that the world would never discover the monster he truly was. Months passed with no sign of Matthew Peterson. The investigation, once filled with frantic hope, had turned into a cold case. The silence that had fallen over Nicole's death seemed to stretch endlessly, as though the answers were locked behind a door that no one could break down. But then, a breakthrough came from an unlikely source, an anonymous tip. A man, a former associate of Matthew's, had come forward, claiming to know where he was hiding. The tip led investigators to a rundown town on the outskirts of nowhere, a place so isolated it felt like time had forgotten it. Matthew had been living under a new identity, blending in with the shadows of a broken town, trying to rebuild the life he had lost. But it wasn't just his name that had changed, it was everything. The man they found was no longer the charming businessman who once controlled his family with an iron fist. He was gaunt, disheveled, his face hollow from months of fear and paranoia. But it was his eyes that gave him away, those cold, calculating eyes that had once terrified Nicole. As the officers closed in, Matthew didn't try to run. He didn't even flinch. It was almost as if he had been waiting for this moment, knowing it was inevitable. But when they arrested him, when the cuffs clicked around his wrists, Matthew's final act of defiance came in the form of a chilling confession. He had never truly left. He had been watching from the shadows, lurking just out of sight, knowing that the truth would never fully escape him. As the authorities hauled him away, Matthew's words echoed in the darkness, the last thing Nicole's family would ever hear from him. She knew too much. The truth behind Nicole's death, the terror she had faced in her final moments, was now painfully clear. Matthew's reign of terror had ended, but his legacy would haunt everyone who had ever believed in the lies he had built. And as the town settled back into its uneasy calm, one thing remained certain. Nicole Peterson's story was far from forgotten, and the horrors she had faced in silence would forever echo through the shadows.